Life only comes around once, and you're supposed to live it in a way that leaves no room for regret. At first glance, I would have thought I'd done just that. I'd followed the so-called right path, lived responsibly. But as I sat there, sipping my drink, I couldn't help but replay the past few weeks in my mind, trying to gather any concrete evidence of Melanie's betrayal. My stomach was tied in knots, and every minor event that had accumulated only deepened the unease gnawing at me. Something felt seriously wrong. So wrong, but I couldn't quite grasp what it was. I was nearly certain something was happening behind my back, yet I had nothing solid to rely on. No hard proof, no clear idea of who, what, or where. That lingering doubt plagued me, twisting my thoughts, making me wonder if it was all in my head or if she really was sneaking around on me. But despite the constant second-guessing, my gut wouldn't let me shake the feeling that something was off. Whether it was a full-blown affair or just a fling, the more I thought about it, the more undeniable it seemed. I'd been chewing on these suspicions for what felt like an eternity, unable to shake the question of how long it had been going on right under my nose. Taking another slow sip of my Jack Samuel Eels, I gave the bartender a nod. He acknowledged me with a half-smile, like he'd seen men with this look more times than he cared to count. The bar was quiet, filled with low murmurs that faded into the background, mirroring the gray, rainy weather outside. People around me seemed lifeless, like they were just waiting for the rain to let up so they could go home. Only one woman stood out, dressed way too fancy for this dive, throwing glances at anyone who'd look her way and happily accepting drinks from some older guy. He looked hopeful, but he didn't need to be. She was clearly already interested. Most of the others were just sitting around, passing time, waiting for any excuse to leave. I was still there, nursing my drink, unsure what to do next, when a voice from behind made me turn. It was Wendy, staring at me with that sharp gaze of hers, like she could read me like an open book. I tried to say something, but the words just wouldn't come. She stood there, rain dripping from her coat, shrugging it off. I couldn't help but wonder what had brought her here, so I asked. She said she'd been worried about me and had a feeling I'd be in this exact spot. She suggested we sit and talk, and I just stared, trying to figure out her motive, wondering if I could really trust her. I steadied myself with another swig and ordered her a vodka and soda. We waited for the bartender to move along, then picked up our conversation. Our eyes met, both of us feeling the tension, each of us testing the waters of the situation. When he mentioned she'd noticed I seemed to be carrying a weight lately, like a burden too heavy to handle on my own, I held her gaze for a moment before looking away, feeling something unspoken hanging between us that I wasn't ready to address. I told her everything was fine, brushing it all off, but she wasn't buying a word of it. Then it hit me hard. No matter how much I tried to deny it, she could see right through me. She set her glass down, clasped her hands together, and leaned in, hitting me with words that felt like a punch to the gut. She knew what was going on. I played dumb, pretending not to understand, but when he wouldn't let it go, she suggested we move to a booth for some privacy, and although I wasn't exactly thrilled about it, I followed her. Once we were seated, I tried redirecting the conversation, asking her what she thought she knew, hoping to sidestep the topic. But when he wasn't having it, she reminded me that, after everything we'd been through, I couldn't lie to her. And she was right. I'd known Wendy since she was 17, back when I first started dating Melanie. She'd always been in the picture, even had a crush on me, though I'd ended up marrying her sister. Over the years, Melanie and I got married and built what I thought was a perfect life together. We had good jobs, stable incomes, and, from the outside, everything looked like a dream. Meanwhile, Wendy had grown up into a beautiful, self-assured woman. By her mid-20s, she'd become the kind of woman any man would be lucky to know, let alone have as a friend. But sitting across from her in that bar, I couldn't shake the feeling that my marriage, closing in on 5 years, might not make it to 6. Wendy, with that deep concern in her eyes, could see the hurt I was struggling so hard to keep hidden. Before I could stop myself, I felt my heart splintering as she finally said the words I'd been dreading. She looked me straight in the eye and told me, plain as day, that she believed Melanie was cheating on me. My mind went blank, struggling to process her words. I didn't want to hear it, and I certainly didn't want to believe it. A part of me thought that if I just ignored it, it might not be real. Maybe if I kept looking the other way, I could avoid the hurt that came with the truth. Winnie must have noticed my blank stare because she asked if I was in shock or just deep in denial. She said she cared about me and worried that I wasn't seeing things clearly. A part of her even hoped it was all just a big misunderstanding. But I kept brushing her off, clinging stubbornly to my own denial. Finally, Winnie's frustration bubbled over, her eyes flashing with an anger so fierce it even caught the bartender's attention that I quickly waved the bartender away, assuring him it was all under control, while Winnie muttered a quick apology for the outburst. I could tell she was frustrated, but it came from a place of genuine care. She'd always seen herself as my friend, someone who'd stand by me no matter what. She was practically begging me to open my eyes and face the reality she saw so clearly. She said it was time to take action, and even though I wasn't thrilled about where this might lead, I agreed to listen. Winnie started by recounting an odd incident from a few weeks ago when she'd been hanging out with Melanie. Melanie had received a call and, without a word, slipped out of the room to take it. For sisters as close as they were, it seemed strange that Melanie wouldn't just answer in front of her. I felt that all too familiar pang of dread tightening in my gut as Wendy continued. She admitted she'd later checked Melanie's phone. It wasn't even locked. The call had come from someone saved as Camden, a name that meant nothing to Wendy. Curious, she decided to keep an eye out for anything else suspicious. A week or so passed, and Wendy pieced together who this Camden guy was. He was an old friend of Melanie's, someone from before I was in the picture. They'd recently reconnected, maybe through social media or a messaging app, and apparently, they'd been talking for weeks. I told Wendy that I hadn't noticed any signs of something like this, though, admittedly, there'd been a growing distance between Melanie and me. Wendy nodded as I spoke, but continued, explaining that Melanie and Camden weren't doing anything obvious, just little things that combined seemed suspiciously deliberate. I tried to reason it out, suggesting it could be innocent, just two old friends reconnecting. But Wendy shot that down, insisting it seemed like more. Her bluntness caught me off guard, so I asked if there was something big I'd been too blind to see. I mentioned how lately everything felt like it was working against us, with no time left for fun or connection. Wendy looked at me with disbelief. "You've got to stop burying your head in the sand," she said, reminding me that she genuinely cared about what happened to me. I pressed her for details, eager to understand how bad this really was. Her expression told me more than I wanted to know, fueling a slow but steady anger inside me. I demanded specifics. Where, when, how had Melanie been meeting up with this guy? Wendy revealed that Melanie had met up with him at least 3 times in the last 2 weeks. She wasn't sure at first, but 2 days ago, she'd learned something over lunch with a friend who worked with Melanie. Her friend had casually mentioned that Melanie had met the guy twice for lunch and once for dinner just last week. When he asked if those times lined up with anything I'd noticed recently. Thinking it over, a few things started to click. I remember calling Melanie's office to meet for lunch on a couple of those days, only to be told she was either out or had already left. Had those been the times she was with him? And then there was that work seminar last week that supposedly kept her out until well after midnight. She claimed it ran late, and afterward, her team had stayed at the hotel bar for a drink. I recalled that night vividly. No warmth, no connection. She just went straight to the shower, then to bed. My mind was racing as I started piecing together all the scattered clues. Noticing how shaken I was, Wendy urged me not to act impulsively, warning me that I didn't want to do anything I'd regret or get myself into legal trouble. But I was already past that point. I'd made up my mind. She must have seen the resolve in my face because her eyes flickered with worry as I told her I wouldn't tolerate being cheated on and vowed that both Melanie and this Camden would face consequences. Wendy tried to calm me, encouraging me to think it through and not make any rash decisions without a solid plan. Oddly enough, her steady voice did help to rein in my anger, only solidifying my conviction that my suspicions had been dead on. Then I asked if she knew where Melanie might be right then, and without even a moment's hesitation, Wendy replied that she was probably with him. That was why Wendy had tracked me down. Her answer made my blood boil, and before I knew it, my fist hit the table, drawing stares from all around the bar. I waved the bartender over, then turned back to Wendy with a low, fierce demand. Do you know where they are right now? My voice was thick with anger. She admitted she didn't know their exact location, but promised to talk to Melanie the next day to gather more information. The guy was apparently married with kids, though Wendy didn't know where he lived. Still, she vowed to get the details to help me. I reached across the table and gripped her hand, giving it a tight squeeze as I wiped a stray tear from her cheek. Thank you, I murmured, grateful for her support, despite the awkwardness of it all. Wendy looked at me, concern etched in her face, and asked what I planned to do next. I reassured her I wouldn't act impulsively, at least not right away, but I was determined to end this once and for all. I told her there was no way I'd forgive either of them, and I'd make sure they paid for betraying me. In the meantime, I'd protect what was mine and start gathering my own evidence. With a final swig, I drained the last of my Jack, waved to the bartender, and left a tip on the counter. Winnie still seemed uneasy as she asked when I intended to confront Melanie. I thought it over briefly before telling her I'd start by making some calls the next day to secure my assets. I was clear. I wouldn't let Melanie walk away with a single penny of mine. Winnie mentioned how hard it must be to live with her, knowing what I knew, and I admitted that these last few weeks have been pure hell. If Melanie hadn't noticed my growing distance by now, she was blind to everything. Winnie got up to leave, suggesting we meet again tomorrow. I agreed, and she promised to dig up more information. As she slipped in her coat, I helped her with it, and for a brief moment, as I stood close to her, she looked so much like Melanie. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked up at me, and I leaned down to kiss her gently on the cheek, telling her I'd be all right. She gave me a small, sad smile before vanishing into the rainy night. I sat back down, taking a deep breath as I started plotting my next steps. One thing was certain. They wouldn't get away with this. My revenge would be swift, cold, and merciless. After that, things turned into a blur. Somehow, I found myself waking up in my own bed the next morning, my mouth dry and my head throbbing like a jackhammer. Rolling over, I saw that Melanie was already gone, though I could hear faint sounds coming from downstairs. I swung my legs over the bed, stood up, and tried to shake off the remnants of my hangover. Stumbling to the bathroom, my mind spun with memories of the night before and thoughts of what I'd do next. When I walked into the kitchen, Melanie was already there. She looked me up and down and casually asked what kind of shape I was in. I muttered something vague about meeting up with an old friend and having one too many. I poured a glass of orange juice, drained it in one gulp, and poured myself another. She kept pressing for details, asking who this friend was. That's when I realized I needed a story. I mentioned a guy named Camden, an old college buddy in town for business. At the mention of Camden, I saw a flicker of recognition cross her face before she quickly turned away. I continued, talking about our college days and how we played football together. Melanie acted like she didn't remember him, brushing it off, saying it didn't matter as long as I'd had a good time. That was the first red flag. Sitting across from me, she seemed oddly distant, almost like her mind was somewhere else. Casually, I brought up her evening, trying to sound disinterested while watching her reaction closely. She claimed she wrapped up work, grabbed a quick bite and drink with coworkers, and got home around 9:30. But I knew that was a lie. I'd been home until 10 before heading to the bar. That was the second glaring red flag. She went on about her plans for the day, mentioning she might be late again tonight. Then, almost offhandedly, she added that her old friend Camden was supposed to reach out to her. I forced a smile and suggested she invite him over sometime so we could all catch up. She hesitated for a second before agreeing, then asked if I actually remembered Camden. Her tone was casual, but there was an odd tension underneath. I reassured her I was fine and could handle things on my own, though my mind was already racing, figuring out my next moves. After finishing my juice, I took a couple of painkillers and told her I needed to get ready for the day. As I stepped out of the house, one thing was blindingly clear. This wasn't over. Melanie and her lover had no idea what was coming for them. As I buttoned up my shirt, my resolve only hardened. I was done playing along in this charade. The idea of her sneaking off to see Camden lit a fire in me. And with every second, my need for revenge burned hotter. The anger I felt toward him, a man I barely even knew, grew with each passing thought. The workday was a whirlwind, back-to-back calls, endless meetings, and issues piling up faster than I could handle. My secretary managed to field a few calls, but there was no getting out of the ones that mattered. Despite the constant rush, the tense energy inside me only kept building, driven by the intense need to even the score. By mid-morning, things finally slowed enough for me to take care of my own affairs. I closed my office door and focused on my finances. Within 15 minutes, I'd moved funds, secured our joint account, and locked down every dollar within my control. I even scheduled a meeting with a divorce lawyer. I figured I'd gather a bit more proof, but honestly, it barely mattered at this point. Melanie had her own accounts, but I wasn't worried about those. My priority was the joint account, and now it was safely under my control. With no kids to worry about, a clean split was all I wanted if it came to that. The only way I could see moving forward was if Melanie confessed everything and begged for forgiveness. And if she even hesitated, I knew it was already over. That heavy realization settled over me, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Sure, it saddened me, but I was too far down this road to turn back. Sitting there in my office, I found myself reflecting on all that had happened and all I'd done to prepare. I needed more details on Camden, more proof. Or maybe just knowing the truth was all I needed to take them both down. Just then, my phone buzzed, jolting me back to reality. It was Wendy. I told her I'd been busy securing my assets, and she updated me on Cam and Clifford. He was married too, and she'd managed to dig up his home address and workplace, thanks to a friend who'd spotted him with Melanie. According to Wendy, things were getting serious between them, though they were doing their best to keep it under wraps. Finally feeling like I had something concrete, I asked her to send over everything she'd found on Camden. Before long, I tracked down his social media profile and stared at his picture, feeling a strange, vague memory of him tugged at the back of my mind. I decided to mix things up and called Melanie around lunchtime. As we chatted, she casually mentioned she had a meeting with a client named Mr. Clifford. Hearing his name come from her mouth was like a slap in the face, a taunt just shy of mocking. I kept my emotions under wraps, held my tone steady, even as I burned inside. Strike three, I thought, and made up my mind swift, merciless action was the only way forward. After hanging up, I sat there gripping the edge of my desk, my jaw clenched tight in anger. I forced myself to tell her I'd see her later, barely keeping it together as she said, "I love you." Just then, my secretary poked her head in and offered to pick up lunch from the deli down the street. Without looking up, I told her to bring me something heavy on red meat, something I could tear into. She raised an eyebrow, probably sensing something off, but said nothing as she closed the door behind her. She must have felt the tension, picking up on the energy I'd been giving off all morning. While I waited, Wendy was busy running down leads of her own. Wendy had made her way to Melanie's office and saw her stepping out of the elevator with a tall, dark-haired man, Camden Clifford himself. Without hesitating, she walked right up to them and casually asked Camden how long he'd known Melanie. He looked startled, stumbling over his words as Melanie quickly pulled him aside, muttering something about a meeting they were late for. They rushed outside and hopped into a waiting cab, but not before Melanie shot a nervous glance back at Wendy. Meanwhile, back in my office, I chewed slowly on a massive sub, savoring every bite of the red meat as I considered my next move. Wendy called to confirm Melanie had left her office, and after a quick check with her secretary, it was clear she wouldn't be returning for the rest of the afternoon. With my finances locked down and the locksmith ready to change the locks on command, everything was in place. My lawyer was on standby, awaiting my final go-ahead. Tonight would be the start of my plan. I wasn't about to tip my hand just yet. I wanted them to feel secure, let them think they were in the clear right before the fall. My dad always used to say, "Never let him see you coming. Go straight for the kill." It was time to remember those words and make things right. That evening, Melanie walked in like it was any other night, as if nothing had changed. She acted completely normal, until I caught a faint whiff of men's cologne clinging to her clothes. As I leaned in for a kiss, she noticed my hesitation. Without a word, I gave her a light peck on the cheek and headed toward the door. She called after me, asking if everything was okay and what I was up to. I told her I was heading to a poker night with some work buddies. That seemed to be enough for her. Once outside, I climbed into my car, clenching my jaw as I backed out of the driveway. I drove straight to Samuel's place, my mind racing with everything that lay ahead. Samuel was an old friend, the kind of guy you could depend on without a second thought. He'd had his own run-ins with the law and plenty of combat training, making him the perfect partner for what I was planning. When I called him earlier, he hadn't asked a single question, just solid loyalty. Exactly what I needed. I arrived at Samuel's place, and without wasting time on small talk, we headed straight to the garage. I changed into dark overalls and pulled on a ski mask. Together, we looked like shadows, moving silently as we got into an old, beat-up car Samuel had picked up a while back, the kind of car that wouldn't draw attention. We drove across town, following the address Winnie had sent me. We didn't need words. Every detail had already been set. Samuel parked outside Cam and Clifford's house, and we sat in silence, waiting, each of us mentally preparing for what was coming. The house was mostly dark, save for a single light glowing from within. After a few minutes, the front door opened, and Cameron stepped out, got into his car, and drove off. We followed at a safe distance. There was no need to rush. We knew exactly where he was headed. At the driving range, we parked in the shadows and waited, watching as the parking lot slowly emptied, leaving only a handful of cars. My anger was a low burn, simmering just beneath the surface, making it difficult to sit still. Every part of me wanted to storm over there and confront him, but I knew the timing wasn't right. So, we waited. When Camden finally made his way back to his car, Samuel slipped out of our vehicle, moving with that practiced, quiet ease of his, ready for whatever came next. After Samuel finished up with what we'd planned, I drove us out of the lot carefully, keeping everything as low-key as possible. As Samuel peeled off his gloves and mask, he commented on how smoothly everything had gone. I glanced over, genuinely grateful, and thanked him, telling him how much his help meant. Samuel just shrugged it off, saying he still owed me for things in the past and could never fully pay me back. I reminded him that real friendship means having each other's backs, no debts or tallies. At least, I added, his hands were clean, and with no cameras in the lot, we had nothing to worry about. Feeling a grim satisfaction with how the night had unfolded, we headed back. Samuel suggested we join the others for poker, saying they were probably gathered at his place by now. We spent the next 4 hours at the card table, the atmosphere light and full of camaraderie. The guys noticed something was up with me and offered their quiet support, which only strengthened my resolve for what was coming next with Melanie. But before I confronted her, I had a few mind games in mind to keep her on edge, guessing. I stumbled through my front door just after 1 a.m., putting on a sloppy, exaggerated drunken swagger. Samuel had one of the guys drop me off, so my car was still at his place, a perfect excuse. Melanie was still up, and she shot me a suspicious look as soon as I walked in, asking why I was so late. I brushed her off with a slurred response, explaining that Samuel and the others had driven me home since I'd had way too much Jack Samuelios. I made a feeble attempt to hang my jacket on the peg, missing it entirely, and then collapsed onto the sofa. Melanie sat across from me, arms crossed, disgust clear in her expression. I kept my face blank, waiting for her to break the silence. She didn't hold back long, blurting, "What's going on with you, Theodore? Is there someone else? You've been acting really strange lately." I fought back the surge of anger, forcing a lazy chuckle instead. Keeping my cool, I replied, "I'm fine. Just going through a rough patch, but don't worry. It'll all be over soon." My words lingered in the air, and I could tell they unsettled her, like she sensed something was off but couldn't quite grasp what. Eventually, we headed to bed, and I pretended to fall asleep right away, breathing deeply and steadily. It seemed to frustrate her. It was as if she wanted to start a confrontation, but I wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. Not yet. The next morning, she was up first, brewing coffee in the kitchen. I dragged myself downstairs, keeping up the hungover act and exaggerating every move. With a groan, I greeted her, rubbing my temples and mentioning my pounding headache. She tossed me some painkillers without much enthusiasm. As I sipped my coffee, my eyes landed on her phone, sitting right there on the kitchen table. I sensed her unease immediately, like she wanted to grab her phone, but didn't want to make it obvious. I poured myself some orange juice and, acting casual, picked up her phone, making it look like I was just moving it aside. A flash of panic crossed her face as I glanced at an incoming message. Handing it back, I casually mentioned that her battery looked low, adding she wouldn't want to miss any important messages. Without waiting for her reaction, I left the kitchen and headed upstairs to get dressed. She watched me go, visibly rattled, probably wondering if I knew something, but tried to convince herself I was still in the dark. She likely thought her affair was harmless, just a few weeks of lunches, dinners, and 3 hotel meetups. To her, it was innocent fun, and she believed I'd never suspect anything since, in her mind, I hadn't noticed anything missing at home. When I rushed downstairs, I sidestepped Melanie's attempt at a more affectionate goodbye, slipping out the door with a quick wave and a forced smile. Once at work, I wasted no time pushing more of my plan into motion. Around 11 a.m., I sent Melanie a text, keeping it casual. I apologized for being distant lately, told her I had a lot on my mind, but promised her everything would be sorted out soon. I leaned back in my chair, eager to see how she'd react. Later that day, when he stopped by my office, concern written all over her face. She looked at me directly, her voice quiet but firm, asking what had happened, especially with Camden. Playing the part, I looked at Wendy with feigned confusion, prompting her to explain more. That morning, someone at the golf club had found Camden Clifford stuffed into the trunk of his own car, badly beaten. Melanie, apparently shaken, had confided the details to Wendy. Wendy, never one to mince words, asked me directly if I'd had anything to do with it. Keeping my expression cool and indifferent, I denied it, mentioning that Melanie had shared the news during a work-related call, that Camden had been hospitalized, confirmed by his wife. Wendy seemed to accept my answer, though she warned that things might not be as simple next time. When she asked what I meant, I just smirked, replying, "Accidents happen in the strangest places." That evening, I arrived home to find Melanie gone, her car missing from the driveway. A bit annoyed, I called her, putting on a cheerful tone as I asked where she was. She told me she was visiting a friend in the hospital and assured me she'd be back soon. I offered a quick, "Hope your friend feels better," and hung up before she could respond. About half an hour later, Melanie walked through the door, looking exhausted. I casually asked about her friend, making it sound like I wasn't too concerned. She paused, then said it was just a minor accident, and her friend would be fine soon. Her voice wavered a little, like she was trying to hold herself together. I could tell something had her rattled. I offered to make us some coffee, and as we sat sipping, she seemed to relax. Almost offhandedly, she mentioned that one of her company's reps had been attacked recently. Feigning surprise, I asked for more details. She explained that Camden had been assaulted and left in his car overnight, but assured me he hadn't been seriously hurt. She speculated that the attackers only meant to scare him, since nothing was stolen. I struggled to keep a straight face, knowing my earlier denial of even knowing Camden must have only complicated things for her. Melanie caught on to my skeptical look, her expression tightening, as though realizing she might have said too much. She quickly changed the subject, but it was too late. I'd already put it all together. Moments later, she excused herself and left the room, likely to make a phone call. It was clear to me that things were escalating, and it was time to make my next move. Calling out to her, I mentioned I'd be stepping out and wouldn't be long. Without waiting for a response, I got in my car and drove straight to Camden Clifford's house. When I knocked on the door, a petite, dark-haired woman answered. Introducing myself, I stated plainly that my wife, Melanie, had been having an affair with her husband. She turned pale, visibly shaken, but invited me inside. Once we were seated in the living room, I laid out everything I knew. Apologizing for bringing such painful news, I told her that she deserved to know. I also mentioned that Camden was currently in the hospital, recovering from the recent attack. She broke down, admitting that she'd suspected something was going on for a while. She'd known about Camden's past affairs but hadn't had proof of this one until now. She was exhausted by his lies, and declared she'd be divorcing him without a second thought. She wasn't certain how long things had been going on with Melanie, but she was sure of her involvement. When I asked about the attack on Camden, she admitted she had no idea who could have done it. I clarified that I wasn't involved, but truthfully, I wasn't sorry it had happened either. We speculated on whether Camden had crossed paths with someone else's wife. Her bitter response, "Nothing surprises me anymore," said it all. She shared that they'd moved back to the area to leave behind Camden's past infidelities, hoping he'd changed, but clearly he hadn't. Before I left, I gave her my locksmith and lawyer's contact information, figuring she'd need them soon. On the drive home, my mind was fixed on everything left to do. The anger I felt was cold, calculated, fueling my determination to exact a precise and thorough revenge. The reality of my marriage ending weighed heavily on me, but there was no room for second thoughts. Melanie had betrayed me, and forgiveness was off the table. The only satisfaction left was knowing that the pain she caused me would eventually come back to her. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw Melanie's car parked in its usual spot. Tapping the hood absent-mindedly, it hit me that this might be the last time I'd step through that door as Melanie's husband. Every step toward the house felt like it carried the weight of everything that had happened. When I entered, the heaviness settled over me, pressing down like an invisible force. The soft hum of the television was the only sound as I moved into the living room, where Melanie sat rigidly on the sofa. Her whole posture screamed tension, as if she knew everything was about to come crashing down. Her body was stiff, and her eyes darted anxiously, struggling to maintain control. I paused, staring at her, letting the silence stretch as I watched her squirm. I could practically see the fear in her eyes, her mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but she couldn't bring herself to say a word. Without acknowledging her, I walked past and went straight to the liquor cabinet, pouring a stiff drink without breaking eye contact. She could sense the shift in me, but couldn't read my expression. As I took a long, slow sip, I saw her unease deepen. Attempting to take back control, she sat up straighter, finally asking, with a forced hint of irritation, where I'd been. I stared back, expressionless, replying that I'd tell her where I'd been if she first told me where she'd been. Her eyes darted, and she stammered, claiming she'd been at the hospital with a friend. I let her words linger in the air, allowing the lie to settle between us, watching her struggle to keep her story together. When she tried to shift the conversation back to me, I cut her off, no longer willing to play this charade. I told her I'd met someone new today, someone who quickly became a friend. Then, I mentioned Camden Clifford's name, savoring the way her face drained of color. I could almost see her mind scrambling to piece together how much I knew. Feigning concern, she asked if I was all right, offering to get me another drink. Ignoring her, I pressed further, asking her directly about Camden, forcing her to face the truth. I laid everything out on the table. I told her I'd known about her affair with Camden for a while. She immediately tried to brush it off, claiming it was nothing, just a fling. I scoffed, reminding her of our vows and making it clear how furious I was at being deceived. She started apologizing, insisting it didn't mean anything, swearing she'd make it right. I laughed bitterly, telling her she was only sorry because she'd been caught. I demanded to know if she would have ever stopped if I hadn't found out. Her silence answered for her. She wouldn't have. I told her lying had become second nature to her, that she wasn't the woman I'd fallen in love with anymore. My words seemed to shatter whatever confidence she'd been holding on to. She broke down, begging to know what she could do to fix things, swearing she'd do anything. But my decision was already made. "It's too late," I said, my voice cold. "We're done." Then I called Wendy, explaining the situation and asking her to come over to help Melanie pack. Melanie, still in shock, asked where she was supposed to go. I told her bluntly she could go anywhere, even back to her lover at the hospital, for all I cared. When Wendy arrived, she didn't waste any time. She started packing Melanie's belongings into suitcases while I stood there, watching the woman I once loved be removed from my life. Despite everything, I still felt a faint pull to make sure she left safely, that last small thread of care. But that was all I had left to offer. As Melanie walked out, leaving with Wendy, I knew that Camden, lying in his hospital bed, would finally have to face the consequences of his actions just as Melanie would face hers. Two other women Camden had secretly been involved with began to visit him at the hospital, each blissfully unaware of the other's existence, until one fateful afternoon when their paths finally crossed. What followed was a tense confrontation filled with fury, accusations, and heartbreak, laying bare the full extent of Camden's lies and betrayal. Meanwhile, his wife, shattered by the revelation of his infidelities, wasted no time filing for divorce, demanding full custody of their children. Humiliated and furious, she was determined to cut ties completely, leaving Camden to deal with the fallout alone. With the scandal becoming public, Camden's workplace acted quickly, citing corporate ethics violations. They terminated him on the spot, stripping him of his primary income and stability. Legal battles followed, and Camden soon found himself overwhelmed by financial troubles. Between divorce proceedings, alimony demands, and mounting legal fees, his savings dwindled rapidly. With his reputation in tatters, the promising future he'd once had lay in ruins. Even Melanie, who had once found solace in their affair, ended things with him. She couldn't forgive his additional betrayals and the hidden webs he'd woven beyond her. As Camden's life spiraled into isolation, the two women who'd confronted each other at the hospital eventually left him, unwilling to remain tangled in his chaos. His friends and family, repulsed by his actions, distanced themselves, leaving him entirely alone. For the first time, Camden was forced to confront the consequences of his choices, acknowledging the hurt he'd caused not only to others but to himself. Left with little more than the wreckage of his own deceit, Camden faced a broken life from which he might never recover. As the weeks passed, I found myself reflecting on the aftermath of that stormy night. Wendy and I stayed in touch, and in our brief, supportive conversations, she seemed almost relieved that everything was finally out in the open. She was a grounding presence as I adjusted to the stillness in my life now that Melanie was gone. Surprisingly, though, Wendy had grown distant too, as if she needed space to process everything herself. Still, knowing she understood the complexity of my situation provided some comfort. Over the next few months, Melanie came to realize that life would never return to what it once was. Every new partner sensed something about her past, like an invisible shadow she couldn't escape. No matter how much she tried to move forward, there was always a flicker of doubt in their eyes, a subtle pause in their trust. Warm conversations quickly grew tense as suspicion crept in, each man wondering if she would truly remain faithful. As time wore on, Melanie found herself more and more isolated, the dream of a happy family slipping further from her reach. But that chance was gone, and with every failed attempt to connect with someone new, Melanie began to understand just how fragile and rare trust truly was, something she might never reclaim. Left alone, haunted by memories of the life she'd thrown away, Melanie was surrounded by only regrets and what-ifs, confronting the happiness she'd sacrificed. One evening, months later, I crossed paths with Wendy again at a mutual friends gathering. She seemed brighter, more relaxed, and it felt good to see her in a happier place. We exchanged a long, knowing look, as if acknowledging all that lay unspoken between us. There was a new ease in our connection that didn't need words. When Wendy quietly confessed her feelings for me, something shifted inside. I realized that she had always meant more to me than I'd admitted, even to myself. In that quiet moment, surrounded by years of shared memories, I understood that I loved her deeply. Our love story began to unfold simply and honestly. Wendy and I married, cherishing the peace and trust we'd finally found. Our relationship was grounded in mutual respect and loyalty, precious, and something we both knew we had to safeguard. A year and a half after our wedding, we welcomed our son, filling our lives with purpose and joy. 2 years later, we were blessed with a daughter, completing our family. From sleepless nights to first steps and endless laughter, we grew together as parents, savoring each milestone with our children and one another. Wendy and I learned that love and respect were more than just ideals. They became the bedrock of everything that held us together. We treasured our roles as partners and parents, knowing that true happiness came from nurturing the bonds that mattered most. As our children grew, so did our commitment to each other, weaving a legacy of love and trust that would carry us through every joy and challenge life brought our way. Everyone got what they deserved by their behavior.